reason, but
Hello, my name is Dr. Melissa Craddock. I'm curator and assistant director of the Bade Museum of Archaeology, Pacific School of Religion. On behalf of the Bade Museum and the Archaeological Research Facility at UC Berkeley, I'd like to welcome you to today's installment of the Migration, Borderlands, and Social Boundaries in Antiquity lecture series. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to invite my colleague, museum curator Brooke Norton, to read a land statement on behalf of the museum.
We would like to begin by acknowledging that Berkeley, California is on the territory of the Huichin, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone. We respect the land and the people who have stewarded it throughout many generations, and we honor their elders and ancestors. We are living in a moment that warrants deep reflection on our past and present. As a medicating knowledge of the archaeology and history of the ancient Levant, the Bade Museum welcomes scholarly discussions across boundaries of nationality, religion, gender, and other aspects of identity. We particularly welcome scholars who are engaging with risky topics in today's fraught political landscape and whose scholarship bridges past and present through the study of issues like migration, borderlands, and social boundaries. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Brooke. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Danielle Candelora is an Egyptian archaeologist and an assistant professor of classics and Egyptology at the College of the Holy Cross. She earned her PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Cultures from UCLA, and her research investigates the multivariate processes of identity negotiation in contexts of immigration in ancient Egypt, including the Second Intermediate Period, New Kingdom, and Late Period. She's published extensively on the concept of borders and foreigners in ancient Egypt, how immigrants integrated into and influenced Egyptian society, as well as the cultural blending that resulted. Danielle is also co-director of both the Osiris Ta Nabank Research Project and the Museology Field School at the Museo Egizio de Torino. Dr. Candelora, the floor is yours.
Hey, thank you so much, Melissa and Brooke, for that introduction. And thank you to everyone at the ARF and Berkeley and the Bade for organizing this, this really amazing series. So I'm really glad that Brooke was able to read the land grant or land statement, because that's really applicable to what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to be discussing the concept of ancient Egyptian borderlands and looking at immigration, specifically to the eastern delta of Egypt in the second millennium BCE. All righty. So when we think of borders, we tend to think of lines on a map, which define not only the sovereignty of a state, but who belongs within it. So borders serve to separate us from them, citizens from immigrants. And Egypt is perhaps one of the most alluring of ancient civilizations in which to see modern notions of borders, because of the uniqueness of its geographic context. It's really common to read in textbooks and things like that about the firmness of Egypt's natural borders, which fall at the Mediterranean in the north, the Red Sea, the sort of vast expanse of the Western Desert in the west, and the First Cataract of the Nile in the south, which, especially when mapped out like this map, form almost a neat square, which we can assume, which many assume, encompasses a singular shared Egyptian identity, surrounded on all sides by different foreigners or foreign groups. And this in turn gives rise to this extremely pervasive notion in Egyptology that Egypt is isolated within these borders. But this concept of the border and its relationship to national identity is a relatively modern invention. Numerous studies have shown that the idea of borders as state limits was essentially invented with the signing of the treaties of Westphalia at the end of the 30 Years' War in Europe. And essentially, these treaties were agreements to limit state power through the partition of space, but gave rise to As Cesari put it, a long-lasting tautology whereby territory is defined by state, state by sovereignty, and sovereignty by territory. And I think we can certainly add in a sense of nation or national identity into this circular reasoning. This system, of course, received its current form after the mapping out of what we now even go so far as to call nation states after the World Wars and the fall of the Soviet Union, as you can see in the UN Charter here. And it actually so completely structures our understanding of territoriality and borders and identity that border studies are even traditionally done in political science and geography departments. And we have coined terms like geopolitics. But even a brief review of modern borders shows that this kind of neat definition need not apply for a couple of reasons. I'll give you a few examples here. So borders often correspond with natural features in the landscape like mountain ranges or rivers, principally because those features actually exist in reality. Otherwise, the lines on a map don't translate into a lived experience. And even when you construct an encounterable border on the landscape, like a border wall or a fence, those are highly unenforceable. And in fact, in our current climate, politically speaking, there's a lot of literature coming out quickly about how unenforceable these border walls actually are. Number two, borders need not conform to geography at all. So for example, border control checkpoints in airports often fall somewhere deep within the geographic interior of the state. Ambassadors have diplomatic immunity, meaning these individuals technically embody the border and take it with them wherever they go. And embassies themselves are little sovereign islands within other states. And then finally, modern political claims to territory don't correspond with actual control or sovereignty in a lot of cases. So despite lacking the ability to control or even exploit the land, the US and China have both planted their flags on the moon. And in 2007, Russia actually used a submersible to plant their flag on the North Pole seabed, kind of claiming their ownership over its resources, even though they don't yet have the technology to exploit that landscape. Similarly, there are several issues with assuming a bordered state serves as a geographic container of sorts for a shared identity for a nation. Number one, again, a couple of examples here. Identities can be linked to space, they often are, but usually on a much more local level than the nation, unless you're really zooming out and looking at an international scale. Again, for example, in early 20th century Italy, individuals were far more likely to ascribe to identities that were linked to things like villages or regions, rather than considering themselves to be Italian generally. And in fact, differences between Northern and Southern Italians were extreme enough that spoken dialects impeded communication, and cultural differences, which aligned more with general sort of European or Mediterranean groups, respectively, actually inspired mutual disdain. And I work in Italy today, and you can still see sort of like hints of this today. Individuals didn't identify as collectively Italian until they immigrated to foreign countries. And even the immigrants in diasporic groups tended to cluster around their home region. So even when they go abroad, they tend to stay with people from a more local scale. Number two, many identities don't correspond with state borders at all. There are around 200 states or countries globally, depending on how you define that. But scholars like Paasi argued that there are over 500 discernible nations globally, showing that multiple collective identities often exist within the borders of a single state and can transcend them as well. So diasporic communities, for example, often share collective identities that are still tied to, but occur well beyond a specific territory. And then finally, it's important to consider that these borders, which we feel relatively secure about in the modern world, are really very fluid and constantly changing. And that's especially true almost the further back in time you go. But to give, again, a modern example, the border between Bangladesh and northeastern India that was imposed by the British, in some cases, the border was actually established running straight through extended family compounds. Both the families and the border control agents and forces that were involved complained a lot about the arbitrariness of the division, both in territory and national identity, arguing that people on both sides of the fence shared blood, language, clothing, cultural practices, etc., and that daily cross-border visits and even marriages continued in spite of the new fence. Okay. So newer, more recent investigations into borders have been working to remove our Westphalian blinders about territorial sovereignty and national identity. A lot of recent scholarship has made it clear that geographic, political, and cultural borders are discontiguous more often than not, and that even the most fortified and surveilled of borders are quite permeable. So borders instead, now we're thinking of them as being able to overlap, change over time, and be fuzzy. And indeed, it's the study of native groups that have been extremely helpful in presenting alternative models of territoriality for us to kind of help get us away from our ingrained framework. So in North America, for example, native groups did not entertain such bounded notions of land ownership or sovereignty as linked to group identity. And they kind of had to be forced into these legal constraints by the westward expansion of the United States. So tribal groups with diverse leadership structures were assigned a single leader who were meant to embody sovereignty, and the tribe was then assigned a parcel of land over which they previously had no notions of claim. And this fascinating project called Native Land Digital is reconstructing a map of indigenous groups around the world. And the outcome has produced a map that really defies our Westphalian expectations. So showing territories that overlap, that blur, and that also, really importantly, leave some unclaimed areas. It also makes clear how crucial scale is to this discussion. So some relationships and overlaps are only visible at the most local of levels. Okay. So in this process of sort of redefining borders, we're reconceiving of them not as fixed lines, but as bordering processes, dynamic practices that define inclusion and exclusion between both territories and peoples. They're social and political constructs that are really context and audience dependent. You're going to hear that phrase a lot in this talk, apologies, and need constant reification through everything from surveillance and fortification, which we're more familiar with in the modern world, to ideological rhetoric or ritual acts. So this approach really demands a bottom-up perspective focused on the actors and the practices that both create and maintain these divisions. It also allows us to see borders less as a line and more as a borderland, a cultural interface or zone where identity is negotiated and cultural production occurs. The other fun thing is that instead of treating the border as the edge or the periphery, this framework treats the border as the center for at least some of the population, and acknowledges that borders and borderlands can occur within the interior of a state as well. So again, another example, the original Mason-Dixon line was originally established to mark the division in territory between several states and formed a border within the interior of the United States. It's even marked on the landscape with stela, which is a very ancient world thing to do. But this border didn't coincide with a lot of things, with groups who consider themselves to be culturally Southern or Northern. It did not coincide with the practice divide between slave holding and free states, the division between the Union and the Confederacy, nor did it mark a boundary north of which like institutional racism ceases to exist, right? So in this sense, linear borders are really myopic constructs that tell us very little about reality and lived experience. Okay. So in the study of ancient Egypt, liminal places and their populations are often approached differently, whether or not that place is viewed as part of a sovereign territory called Egypt. It really changes whether it's approached as everyone's Egyptian or there are foreigners involved. Research questions concerning foreigners are also often developed around the flawed concept of a national, singular, pan-Egyptian identity that was contained within these geographic borders to compare foreigners against. So really importantly, and I'm happy to expand on this in the Q&A because there's a lot more we can say, but I'm just trying to give you a very quick show. That even the ancient Egyptians recognized their own amorphous borders and their multiple identities that fell within their borders. So the first Upper Egyptian nome down here was known as Ta Seti, which you can translate as the Nubian land. And in the Western Delta and Red Sea coast, we have areas known as the Haset, which translates to foreign land, even though those fall within the borders of Egypt, of the Chemahu, a sort of Libyan Western Desert group, and the Aamu, or Southwest Asians, respectively. Several texts, including the very famous Story of Sinewe and Papyrus Anastasi I, emphasize not just the geographic, but the cultural dislocation, the disturbance and feelings of unbelonging that one might experience even in a different region within Egypt's borders. So Sinewe even describes his disorientation at finding himself abroad by comparing it to a Delta man seeing himself in Elephantine, demonstrating again that there's no singular national Egyptian identity. So again, by recentering the border, regardless of where it falls, in Egypt or beyond Egypt or between Egypt and something else, it's possible to focus instead on local identity expressions, working from the bottom up to investigate human agency, accommodation and adaptation in sort of day-to-day, face-to-face interactions between different people in these contact zones. And while traditional approaches to borders that see them as lines tend to see rigid distinctions between homogeneous identities on both sides of the border, Borderlands frameworks presuppose that the interacting identities are inherently fluid and constantly changing. These zones are characterized by entanglement because the groups in contact are attempting to understand and accommodate one another, to live together, which results in novel cultural production, hybridized material culture, mutually constituted worldviews, new cuisines, and practices that draw from both traditions. In the case of the US-Mexico border, Anzaldúa described this as the locus where two worlds merge to form a third country, a border culture. Okay, and these borderlands, of course, are not just the locus for contact and exchange, but are often areas that experience heightened immigration. And most studies of immigration in ancient Egypt employ the concept of Egyptianization, assuming that immigrants to Egypt would have tried to become as Egyptian as possible as quickly as they could. Common refrains in scholarship, like the one shown here, suggest that immigrants, again, would have shed any indications of their foreignness and tried to act as Egyptian as possible and therefore be Egyptians. But in the millennia of immigration to ancient Egypt, full Egyptianization was never the only acculturative outcome to have been pursued. In each case, immigrants struck something more like an acculturative balance between their cultures of origin and their new host society, something which Barry refers to as integration. And beyond that, modern immigrants and studies thereof have shown that immigrants often commodify their ethnic capital, capitalizing on their foreignness or deliberately, pardon me, cultivating specific ethnic markers to improve their lives in some way. This capitalization allows immigrants to alter relationships of power with locals, positioning themselves as the expert in certain skills or products that are linked with that ethnicity, and so can earn them credit, if you will, in both economic and social form. So a quick way to understand sort of ethnic capitalization by immigrants would be you're much more likely to go to a sushi restaurant where the chefs are Japanese, and where they kind of make it public and known that they're Japanese. Okay. Immigrants, of course, may also have elected to maintain aspects of their identity that are simply just important to them, or sort of outwardly signaled group belonging. Okay. So like I said, immigrants from all of the regions surrounding Egypt retained aspects of their identities and cultures of origin, even preserving elements that could be performed publicly through things like self-presentation and dress, adornment, etc. Nubians, Libyans, and West Asians tend to have maintained their own cultural dress and hairstyles. And many examples can be found of immigrants capitalizing on ethnic markers like these, such as the stela in the center from Amarna, which depicts a man drinking from a straw, utilizing artistic motifs that are commonly employed in Egyptian art to denote West Asian origins. So specifically that mushroom-shaped hairstyle and the large beard. He also happens to bear what is likely a Semitic name, Terrer, and has a spear behind him, which is a weapon that's usually associated with charioteer warriors. In this case, it's likely we could make the argument that this individual commissioned the stela, suggesting that he was intentionally highlighting these particular ethnic markers that would associate him with a tradition of skilled charioteers from West Asia. Yet even in this case, Terrer apparently decides to blend these West Asian symbols with Egyptian iconographic traditions. So he shows himself in that ochre skin tone, that reddish skin tone that's typically used in Egyptian art to show that the man was Egyptian rather than a foreigner. The form of the stela is consistent with Egyptian customs. The inscription is written in the Egyptian language. And overall, this piece is reflective of the Egyptian religious system, suggesting again that Terrer was a man who potentially conceived of himself both as Egyptian and West Asian. Another particularly interesting example from the late period, but I can't let this one go because it's so interesting to me, is the funerary stela of Jedherbes from Saqqara in the Persian period specifically. And the stela displays a funerary inscription in both hieroglyphic and demotic scripts, and lists Jedherbes' mother as Ta-Nofret-Her and father as Artam, so potentially an Egyptian mother and a Persian father. The lunette features a winged sun disk. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but if you can, up here. A winged sun disk that, due to the addition of a feathered tail and these spirals in place of what in a traditional Egyptian winged sun disk should be called pendant uraei, so the draping cobras, bears more resemblance in this case to Achaemenid symbols of Zoroastrianism than what we would expect typically from an Egyptian stela. Further, while the upper register is a relatively standard scene of the deceased being mummified by Anubis, the lower register actually selectively combines elements from Egyptian offering scenes and from Achaemenid presentation scenes. So really interestingly, in the inscriptions, Jed Hairbase doesn't outright claim either Egyptian or Persian identities, but the collective might suggest his embodiment maybe of a third identity, characteristic of this southwestern borderland of the Persian Empire. And this fascinating find really also emphasizes the need to develop new frameworks to better understand not just immigration in Egypt, but also second generation and later descendants. All right, so turning now to the Eastern Delta, I'd like to spend just a quick minute problematizing the border and kind of introducing you to the area. So immigration in this region here really escalated in the second millennium BC, and kings of actual foreign descent, of West Asian descent, known as the Hyksos, even took the throne in this borderland, ruling from their capital city of Avaris, or Tel el-Daba, during what we call the Second Intermediate Period. And really interestingly, the location of the actual political ideological border shifted frequently throughout pharaonic history. So it's not like we have a very clear, like, this is the northeast border and it never moves. That's not true. Sources like Papyrus Anastasi IV refer to the city of Pyramus, here just north of Avaris, as the border between Egypt and West Asia, while ideological or like military texts from the New Kingdom name kings as extending their borders to sort of the far-flung edges of the empire, usually somewhere up here near the Euphrates River at Nahrin. And then thirdly, third border, there's a string of fortresses built along the coast in the Sinai, so potentially representing in this case like a third fortified, if a little bit strung out border in this northeastern interaction area. If you zoom in on the Second Intermediate Period in particular, the location of this border actually shifts literally from text to text. So in the case of the first stela of Kamos, the king very famously is complaining that he has to share Egypt with a Southwest Asian and a Nubian, which indicates to me that Kamos, or the author of this text, believed that the areas that they held in the north and the south did fall within the official borders of Egypt. He considered them to be part of Egypt. Excuse me. However, in the following response by Kamos's own advisors, they're kind of urging restraint, saying that we're in possession of our Egypt, and he, the Hyksos Apepi, holds the land of the Aamu, we have Egypt. So according to the members of the king's council, the land the Hyksos control are ideologically distinct from their Egypt, and therefore outside of its borders. So we're talking about the same text, like a line later. Avaris is in Egypt and not in Egypt. And even the determinatives or the classifier signs used after the name of the city in texts from this period changed to signal whether the author, again, considered it to be within the borders of Egypt or not. The 17th dynasty Egyptian texts tend to use the N25 classifier at the top, so a set of hills or mountains, which is usually used to explain that a place was in a foreign land. While the Hyksos sources tend to use O49, which is a city sign and is usually stuck on at the end of any city or village that was in Egypt proper. So again, we're ideologically locating the same city both within and outside of Egypt's borders during the same chronological period, really demonstrating in this case how context-dependent and malleable the notion of borders can be. So therefore, I would argue that the region of the Eastern Delta is better approached as a borderland rather than a firm border. Interaction between locals and Southwest Asians, as well as a continuous multi-directional mobility, was a constant characteristic of this zone. Trade and resource expeditions were launched from the region both by land and sea, ensuring that the focus of this borderland was kind of split evenly, if you will, between the rest of Egypt, as well as the Mediterranean and West Asia. Multi-directional immigration, sort of in both directions, between the Eastern Delta and West Asia is attested as early as the pre-dynastic period, and it produced a unique borderland identity here that drew from both cultural traditions and was distinct in many ways from that of the Nile Valley proper, especially as you get further south toward Thebes. And in this liminal context, many West Asian immigrants, including the Hyksos kings themselves, found it advantageous not only to adapt to certain Egyptian customs, but to preserve and advertise aspects of their own origins. And they did so really strategically, depending on what audience they were trying to speak to. Okay, so self-presentation, like personal style and adornment, again, are incredibly public statements about identity. And it's really interesting to consider that we don't have any direct visual evidence of the Hyksos kings themselves, and to consider whether that's a chance of preservation or a conscious choice on their part. And I don't have an answer for you, but it's an interesting conundrum. But excavators and researchers have uncovered quite a bit of what we might call proxy evidence for West Asian styles that were consciously preserved and displayed over several generations after immigration. These include things like brightly colored woven garments, usually held at the shoulder with toggle pins, and these pins are commonly found in burials from this period. The signature mushroom haircut, and that haircut is actually found extending down into the Nile Valley through the New Kingdom as well, suggesting that these people are maintaining these customs over a few generations. The Hyksos rulers did adopt and adapt aspects of Egyptian culture, especially when dealing directly with Egyptian audiences. They tend to present themselves as fully Egyptian. So for example, the scribal palette here on the slide was gifted from the Hyksos Apepi to one of his officials of Egyptian descent named Atju. And on it, Apepi portrays himself as the archetypal Egyptian king. He upholds cosmic order. He's personally instructed by Thoth. He's the living embodiment of the sun god, et cetera, et cetera. They even take on Egyptian titles and throne names and epithets and things like that, especially when facing Egyptian audiences. In other cases, like in Delta contexts, where this door jamb was found, their self-presentation becomes more hybrid. So this door jamb of Seker hair testifies to the fact that they do adopt the fivefold, or sort of the five titles of Egyptian kings, as well as producing monumental inscriptions in hieroglyphic. This guy takes Egyptian names to match his Egyptian titles, but it's right here at the end of the inscription where things get interesting and blended. He brings in a new title, the Hekahasut title, which is the origin of the word Hyksos, meaning ruler of foreign lands. And he puts it in combination with his personal Semitic name, Seker hair, which he puts in a cartouche, which is an incredibly Egyptian symbol of kingship. So we've got this weird sort of blended title. I'll talk more about that in a second. His Semitic foreign name in an Egyptian symbol of kingship. And when it comes to the titles themselves, one of the longest standing assumptions about the Hyksos is that it was Egyptians who gave them this title, probably as a way to mark them as both foreign and as somehow like subordinate to a true Egyptian king. But in a diachronic study of occurrences of the title, I was able to show that while the Egyptians do use this title for several foreign leaders throughout Egyptian history, they never refer to the Hyksos using this title. And contemporary examples from the Second Intermediate period, as you can see here, only appear on objects that would have been commissioned by the Hyksos or for them. So it's likely that these rulers adopt this title for themselves, which of course raises the question of why this title, why such a purposeful choice of this title? What meaning did this title hold for them? I'd suggest it's an attempt to justify their actions in terms of what they perceive to be their partner's cultural premises. So they're coming to this borderland context and know that they have West Asian and Egyptian and probably blended constituents, if you will, that they're ruling over. And so they're trying to find a way to sort of cater to all of these audiences at once. And by adopting this title, but keeping maybe their Semitic names, they're able to commemorate their foreign origins, but in a way that still conveys their royalty and power, because it uses a title that comes from the Egyptian cultural milieu. And the choice of title also brings up what are the foreign lands in this case? The title is Rulers of Foreign Lands. So what are the foreign lands? Is this meant to indicate that the kings are foreign? Or is Egypt the foreign land in this situation? Or might its significance have shifted depending on the audience within this borderland? So in terms of broadcasting their Southwest Asian identity, perhaps no more brazen declaration exists than that many of the monumental buildings on the landscape of Avaris under the Hyksos were of West Asian architectural style. We're used to looking at, ground plans like this, only foundation levels. But if we consider these buildings in their prime, we would see a whole cityscape where monumental buildings were scattered throughout several locations of the city, including a palace compound, monumental temples, and a fortification wall ringing the whole city. And so it's very likely that the landscape or the cityscape of Avaris would have rendered this city instantly recognizable as West Asian, or at the very least hybrid. Just like the major architecture of Ptolemaic Alexandria would have been unmistakably Greek. And so in this case, we've got the Greek monuments of Alexandria perched right at the edge of the Mediterranean, nearest to the Greek mainland. And they serve to act as clear signals of Ptolemaic identity and their links to the Greco-Macedonian world. So I'd suggest that the architecture at Avaris is working in much the same way. It's located at the boundary of Egypt and the Levant, and the West Asian-ness of the city serves to broadcast Hyksos identity abroad and south in Egypt, communicating things like kinship ties to the east or the northeast. And this advertisement or sort of highlighting of their Eastern culture could have been advantageous to their rule through continuing contact with political allies and lucrative trade networks in the Levant and Syro-Mesopotamia, and kind of as communicating their difference to the southern part of Egypt. But if we shift the perspective to West Asia looking into the Eastern Delta, the Hyksos also use this borderland region to present themselves as more Egyptian, communicating perhaps a sense of exoticness or access to desirable resources for their West Asian contemporaries, right? Egypt was the gateway to the gold that everybody wanted. One great example of this is their usurpation of the sphinxes of Amenemhet III, which they relocated probably to place them sort of right on the border, facing out to the Levant. And they reinscribe them with their names, which I'll get to in a second. Okay, so the sphinxes are a really incredibly clever borderland choice, as the lion is a recognizable symbol of royal power from the Near East, though the sphinx is a very distinctly Egyptian version. It's also interesting that even the act of usurpation itself, the carving of the Hyksos' name on the piece, seems to have been done in a negotiated way, which maybe I can explain better if I explain the traditional Egyptian way to steal a statue, is according to Egyptian rules of frontality, so everything should be perpendicular, 90 degrees, etc. You see here a later usurpation by Merentah, where he kind of slaps his cartouches at sort of a 90-degree angle to the frontal part of the sculpture, right? Everything is very axial and clear. Instead, the Hyksos, while they do use hieroglyphic to write their names, they follow the musculature of the left shoulder here and here, which is really starkly different than how an Egyptian would have gone about usurping a statue. All right, so turning now to even their ruling strategies, we can see a careful negotiation of identity, especially in their Delta borderland context. Up here in the Delta, they seem to have operated more as a city-state political structure with vassals, and their administration reflects a patrimonial kinship structure, both of which are more familiar from West Asia. They maintain diplomatic and trade relationships with both West Asia and Southern Egypt, and they import and syncretize West Asian cult with Egyptian traditions. So we're going to dive into each of these a little bit more. Okay, so we can see this fluid shifting in between identities in their diplomatic efforts. So as they reach abroad to West Asia, there's a theory out there that they're sending sort of earlier Egyptian statues, like the one on the slide, out to other royal courts as diplomatic gifts. So this Sphinx here was actually found in a royal tomb at Katna. And this might have served again to reinforce the idea that the Hyksos are the gateway to Egyptian resources. While diplomatic correspondence is actually done in traditional West Asian modalities, so by cuneiform letter, which they discovered in a palace from the Hyksos period. Instead, if you look south towards southern Egypt, we see much more traditional Egyptian self-presentation by the Hyksos. One of the chief features is that there, as far as I'm aware of everything that has been discovered with names of Hyksos kings on it and stuff in the south, there is a conspicuous lack of the use of the Hekahasut title in the south, in favor of more traditional titles like Sa-Ra, the son of Re. We've got Hyksos seal impressions from southern sites like Edfu and Ourenarde that follow this trend, while simultaneously demonstrating like diplomatic trade links. And in a royal tomb in Thebes, they found a calcite vessel inscribed with the name of the Hyksos Apepi, again, no Hekahasut title here, and his daughter Herit, potentially suggesting a possible diplomatic marriage between the Hyksos and the south. Their administration also reflects an accommodation process that was specifically geared to this borderland community. They include both Egyptians and immigrants or the descendants of immigrants in their administration. They continue to use Egyptian administrative practices like the Egyptian language, scarab seals, titles, things like that. But they simplify what was really an incredibly bloated Egyptian bureaucracy down to two major positions, the treasurer and the king's son, both of whom have much broader authority. And many of the individuals who hold these titles also happen to have Semitic names. So overall suggestive that the Hyksos might have overlaid sort of Egyptian administrative practices onto a much more West Asian style of governance based on kinship affiliation, common at other Middle Bronze polities like Mari, for example. And when we turn now to cult, we can see similar sort of accommodation for their Delta context. Perhaps the most famous example of religious syncretism from the site is the blending of the Egyptian god Seth with a West Asian storm god, maybe Baal or Hadad. And the Hyksos deliberately select this syncretized borderland deity, whose name was Seth of Avaris, as their patron. And they establish a temple and cult that would continue in this borderland for over 400 years. And we know that this borderland identity was persistent for this period because the Ramessid kings, who are themselves originally from the Eastern Delta, adopt the same god as their royal patron, and they actually further establish cults of other Southwest Asian deities at their capital, Pir Ramses, just north of Avaris. In another sacred complex at the site, in this case, Area A2, it features two main temples built, again, both in West Asian architectural style. So the larger Temple 3 down here is a broad room temple structure with central axis. And Temple 2 up here is a much smaller temple, but typifies the bent axis layout. And Bitak, in discussing the architecture of these temples, identifies them with a divine pair. So a male weather god in the larger Temple 3 down here, and Asherah of the sea in Temple 2. Based largely on the enigmatic find, the find of a harpoon head, and the enigmatic, really confusing but fascinating find of a number of acorns that were wrapped in a mud casing and burnt, found on the altar in the courtyard shared between these two temples. You'll notice there's also a lot of pits right near the altar, and Bitak has identified one of these as potentially the tree pit that held the oaks that produced the acorns. And he cites the reference to the Asherah pillar in the book of Judges to propose a cult to Asherah of the sea. And while it's potentially problematic to use a text that postdates the archaeological context to identify this tree cult, and actually I'd like to propose instead that this complex and actually the larger temple, T3, were dedicated to Ishtar, with the focal point of the tree standing in as a very public and visible manifestation of the goddess. And now I have to do a massive side note here. Like I said, there's multiple pits, and in various plan drawings of this in different publications, the number of pits actually changes, as well as their location sometimes. And they've been identified as potentially tree pits. Some of them are offering pits, feasting pits, trash pits, and an equid pit. Beyond that kind of confusing picture, this is not the clearest context for archaeologists to handle, but beyond that, they've never found any evidence for an actual tree, just these weird acorns. And of course, acorns are transportable. So I'd like you to work in a hypothetical world with me for a minute where there was an oak tree, one oak tree in the center of this courtyard. And if so, this would have been an incredibly public display of foreignness for a few reasons. Egyptian temples, especially mortuary temples, often have gardens with trees, but they tend to come in symmetrically planted arrangements with lots of trees, and there are local tree species like acacia and tamarisk, at least until Hatshepsut's very famous importation of trees from Punt. The second reason is that oak trees are not native to Egypt. And this particular species, the downy oak, is indigenous to more northerly latitudes in the Aegean and Anatolia and like the very extremely north of the Levant. And so this oak tree would have had to have been transplanted from abroad and then carefully attended to ensure that it continued to grow and thrive in this drier climate and hotter climate. So if you've read or seen Dune, think of those trees. And then lastly, long-standing Egyptian religious traditions link gods like Hathor and Osiris to trees, but to local tree species. So the selection of an oak could have been an active rejection of Egyptian religious concepts, or I think more likely a strategic entanglement with West Asian beliefs, which tend to tie goddesses like Ishtar not only to oak trees, but also to date palms. And one of the strongest contemporary parallels, sort of architecturally speaking, and maybe also conceptually speaking, for the Area A2 complex actually comes from the Palace of Zimri Lim at Mari, specifically Court 106, which has been identified as the Court of the Palm. And a pit in the center of this court has been argued to have held a palm tree. There's some debate over whether this tree would have been a real tree or artificial, like a wood tree clad in metal. Palm trees are also apparently rarer, slightly rarer in the region around Mari because low winter temperatures can make cultivation of palms difficult. So aside from being placed at the exact center of the court and on axis with the ritual space within, the date palm here is reflected in the famous investiture painting here and here, which identifies the tree as the physical embodiment of Ishtar, and specifically in her role as the goddess of kingship. Okay, so I'm going to argue that the palm tree is the central focus maybe of more public religious rituals happening in the courtyard related to the investiture of the king, while those that were meant for more private eyes or secretive aspects of the ceremony take place inside the adjacent investiture halls. Okay, so potentially the situation at Daba worked in the same way, where the oak would have been the symbol of Ishtar as the recipient of more visible and advertised cult. Note that depending on where you place the pit, it's located in the center of the courtyard and on axis with the Temple 3 here, which is really architecturally similar to Zimri Lim's investiture halls. So in terms of Hyksos identity then, one of the largest structures in the city, but even in the Middle Bronze Age world at the time, was built in a West Asian architectural style and featured a non-native tree that required extra care, serving to really overemphasize origins and foreignness. Okay. Even if you're outside of the courtyard walls, it's very likely the tree would have extended above them, so you would have gotten this same sense even from outside of the temple complex itself. Really reflecting that the Hyksos are working to bring religious elements from their origins into this borderland context. And then to kind of finish up, I wanted to give you an example of how it's becoming increasingly clear that bordering processes occurred within the Eastern Delta borderland as well. It's not just that the borderland as a whole exhibits a kind of third, unique, blended identity, but that there are different identities within the borderland. So in the Second Intermediate period, distinct expressions of hybridity and identity can be recognized throughout the Eastern Delta, and specifically sites in Wadi Tumilat, for example, seem to exhibit a slightly different pattern of hybridity than Avaris. And we can even see this occurring in different neighborhoods within the city of Avaris itself. So for example, the settlement in area F1 of the city displayed a blend of material culture from both Egyptian and West Asian traditions. Houses tended to be of a typical Egyptian layout, but they had attached above ground burial chambers that were identified as houses of the dead attached. They're highlighted in green there for you. That held the remains of family burials and cultic activity that apparently centered on an adult male. Mula has convincingly argued, and really well argued, that these particular installations are really a nice example of like borderland blending, shall we say. The idea of having above ground burial chambers within a settlement context is much more closely aligned with West Asian burial customs than Egyptians, who tended to bury people outside of the settlement. But the fact that these houses of the dead were only accessible from outside of the house rather from somewhere inside the house. She says actually indicates the incorporation of Egyptian notions of separation between the living and the dead. So it's kind of hinting towards both cultural practices. Further, of course, both cultures have a tradition of ancestor worship or veneration. So this particular admixture results in a new tradition that's specific not to the whole Eastern Delta borderland, but to this neighborhood in particular. And you could also argue that the visibility of these vaults, right, because they're above ground, might have acted as sort of outward expressions of group identity or solidarity, a bordering process, if you will, that served to create a unique neighborhood identity in Area F1. And similarly, or like completely oppositely, depending on how you think of this, about 500 meters to the southeast, back in Area A2, we're going to see completely different burial traditions. So this whole complex is incredibly complicated, and its function and nature changed over time rapidly. The area went from a settlement to a temple complex and cemetery, and back to a settlement over the course of about a century, though it's consistently marked by a blend, again, of Egyptian and West Asian cultural traits. The way that hybridity manifested also changed a bit over time. The important part is that none of the tombs from Area A2 from any strata ever had superstructures. So no houses of the dead in this area whatsoever. All of the burials are happening underground, showing a really distinct practice from Area F1 and demarcating, again, a potential border within the larger borderland itself. All right, so to conclude, it's crucial to consider the term border as both a noun and a verb, a thing and a process. The paradox of studying borders in this way is that they both create divisions as well as invite interactions across them. And in the case of ancient Egypt, approaching the borderlands as the core spaces rather than the periphery can help us to mute sort of the overbearing foreigner topos of state rhetoric, as well as the anachronistic imposition of a national Egyptian identity, allowing instead for the examination and nuance of lived reality, both of immigrants and locals in this interaction zone. I really like Borderlands as well because they encourage us to embrace ambiguity as the state of the question, rather than approaching these questions of immigration or ethnic markers or anything like this through false objectivity. In these regions where there was never a pre-contact or like culturally pure phase, identity and immigration remain flexible, multi-directional, and most importantly, messy processes. And maps should probably look much more like the one on the right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Candelora, for this fascinating talk that I found very useful and effective for problematizing and complicating assumptions about identity in the ancient world. And actually, before I launch into my first question for you on that note, I would like to invite the YouTube audience, anyone who's tuning in live, to submit questions or comments that you might have during the next couple of minutes during the Q&A. Okay, so I'd like to start by pulling at a thread that you teased toward the beginning of your talk, where you hinted at the complexity of the relationship, not between, let's say, Egyptians and immigrants or other outsiders, foreigners, but the complexity of the relationship between national and localized identity within ancient Egypt, at least according to the boundaries they're traditionally drawn. You hinted that there's a lot more to unpack there, so I'd like to give you the opportunity to elaborate in whatever direction you want.
Thanks, Melissa. Thank you. Yeah, that was something I definitely had to shorten. So Egypt in particular, because of this assumption of Egypt as isolated, I think people are way more comfortable in sort of buying into the state texts, where it seems like there is something that is Egyptian, and they did not like foreigners, and everyone kind of was on the same page on that front. But if you get away from the state documents and you look more maybe towards the archaeology, for example, you can definitely see regional differences throughout Egypt in terms of practices, material culture. There's a great project, I don't know if it's still running, but out of Austria, that's looking at regionalism and material culture. And more research is starting to be done on this. But then if you're kind of willing to see that variation regionally in archaeology, you can kind of go back then to the texts and start to see, wait a second, there's actually quite a lot of hints in the texts that say, you know, people from the Delta and the South wouldn't have even been able to talk to each other without an interpreter. Or, you know, this like fun sort of fictional story of an eloquent peasant who comes to visit. He has to come from Wadi Netroun down into Egypt, suggesting that they didn't think that this kind of very nearby desert wadi wasn't in Egypt. And you can start to pick out all of these different opinions, I guess, depending on like who wrote the text of what counted as Egypt for them. And there's also a ton of emphasis on people's individual home lands or home cities, for example. So it seems like, again, much more of the sort of identity formation was done locally in Egypt.
A follow-up question, and do you mind exiting your share screen?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, thanks. Just so we can see your face better. Yeah, so on that same note, is there evidence either in the text or material culture, or let's say monumental architecture, or the art historical record of, let's say, the rulers or government bureaucracy attempting to foster a national identity that is trying to kind of swing people towards that center from their regional identities? I guess to what extent can you see that or not in the archaeological record?
That's a really great question. So, okay, I think it's helpful to think of this in terms of elites involved in the government versus sort of your person. Say, I'm not aware of any exerted effort on Lord King kind of foster like a national identity on the sake of like on the part of the regular person, right? But in terms of the elites who are operating in this person's government, there is definitely the sense that there's like a party line that you should be following. And we get hints and starts of this where there's like a back and forth between whether the king has more power or the elites, and whether they're able to sort of exert their local identities a bit more during this period. And so I think probably the famous example would be the first intermediate period into the Middle Kingdom, when all of these government officials who would have had to have been buried like right next to the king up at Giza have all of a sudden gone home and have started to be buried in their sort of ancestral cemeteries, and their tombs are getting bigger and bigger and more elaborate. And then all of a sudden, potentially, Senwosret III comes back and, in order to exert himself, says, no, everyone is coming back to the state capital cemetery to get buried, no longer sort of cutting those ties between the elites and their home regions.
That's a great example. Thank you. On a similar note, but now shifting context a little bit, with the available evidence, are you able to see changes in the Hyksos's blended identities, let's say as a political strategy? So changes over time.
Yeah, that's a great question too. Changes over time is a bit tricky. Anyone who works in the Middle Bronze knows that this is a really contested chronology. So trying to piece that together is difficult. And we have the added complication with the Hyksos that we really have very little direct evidence for the Hyksos. We have a lot more like general information for like West Asian immigrants in the Delta. I would say not chronologically, but like I said, I do think we can see patterns depending on who they're performing for. essentially. One of the biggest patterns that I was able to see being that they do seem to act or present themselves a little bit differently when they're dealing with southern Egypt, as opposed to their own Delta community or West Asia.
Interesting. To just further complicate things, this is a question from Brooke Norton, the curator at the Bade. She asks, at the close of the Second Intermediate Period, Egyptian rulers were eager to erase Hyksos contributions and reestablish Egyptian rule, sort of the traditional normative Egyptian rule. Could you talk a little bit about how some of those blended identities may have actually lived on into the early New Kingdom, and if or how some of the cultural shifts may have lingered on after the Hyksos period?
Yeah, thank you, Brooke. That's a great question. So the Hyksos expulsion, as we like to call it, is really a terrible misnomer because you know, when you think of an expulsion, you tend to think of like a huge population exodus. And yes, I use that term on purpose. So that's not what happened. You know, like the ruling class was kicked out. The sort of regular daily blended population of the Eastern Delta don't go anywhere, right? They continue to live there well through the New Kingdom. And we see this sort of blended kind of half West Asian nature of the Eastern Delta continues all the way through to the Ramessid period, for example, where it's kind of highlighted again because the Ramessids themselves are from the Eastern Delta. But even maybe a good example would be that after the Amarna period, kings like King Tut and Horemheb actually restored the temple to Seth of Avaris and you know, got it up and running again, like they did for so many other temples around Egypt. And so it seems like even for these hyper-traditional, if you will, Egyptian kings, that fostering this kind of blended identity in the Delta was still sort of politically expedient, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's super interesting. Thank you. One final question. This is from a YouTube audience member who asks, have you written this up in a book or a thesis or some other journal article that someone can get a hold of?
Sure, yes. Which part? No. So I have a book that's under review right now on the idea of borders and immigration, sort of writ a bit more generally than this. And then if you visit my academia page, you'll find a lot of papers that I've written on like various small aspects of the subject. And I'm working on a monograph to kind of bring it all together. So, yeah.
Great. Okay, so some things are out already and are available on your academia.edu page, and others are forthcoming.
Yes.
Sounds wonderful. All right, well, please join us in warmly thanking today's speaker, Dr. Danielle Candelora, for sharing her research. And please join us for the next talk in this series, which is on April 3rd at 9:30 a.m. Pacific. Dr. Sarit Paz will be sharing a talk titled Caucasus Connections, Kira Araxi's Migration and Diaspora in the Third Millennium BCE, a view from the Southern Levant. We look forward to seeing you then.